the scorching Saharan sun hung merciless over North Africa in July 1942, with temperatures climbing to a staggering 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Hans Mueller's Panzer IV, the metal walls transformed into instruments of torture. The touch of bare steel could blister skin in seconds. Mueller gripped the controls of the 75mm gun as perspiration pooled inside his goggles, stinging his eyes. Behind him, the Maybach engine thundered at full power, radiating another 20 degrees of unbearable heat into the already suffocating crew compartment. Desert sand infiltrated every gap and seam, clogging ammunition feeds and jamming the manual turret mechanisms that he needed to operate with precision. The commander's voice crackled through the failing radio, barely audible beneath the mechanical chaos. Everyone across the German army knew about the Panzer IV. It was supposed to be Germany's dependable backbone, the rugged machine that would conquer battlefields from North Africa's burning sands all the way to Russia's frozen steppes. The specifications seemed impressive on paper: 25 miles per hour across any terrain, upgraded armor protection, the weapon system that would supposedly win the war. But nobody ever mentioned the grim reality that awaited its crews: 2 weeks. That was the average life expectancy for men fighting inside these machines in conditions like these. Nobody had bothered to explain the catastrophic fuel consumption either. The tank drank diesel at just 2 miles per gallon, which meant crews faced the terrifying prospect of running dry in open desert, stranded and defenseless. And nobody warned the young soldiers what would happen when winter arrived in Russia. At -40 degrees, diesel fuel solidified into useless sludge while ammunition misfired unpredictably. Mueller felt another shell whistle overhead as the true horror of his situation began crystallizing in his mind. The real enemy wasn't waiting outside the tank's armor. The machinery itself was slowly killing him. The desert sun hammered relentlessly against the steel hull as Mueller's Panzer IV crawled across the wasteland. The thermometer showed 122 degrees in the shade, but inside this metal coffin, temperatures exceeded 140 degrees. Every surface had become a branding iron, waiting to sear whatever it touched. The leather seat padding had cracked and peeled away weeks earlier, leaving nothing but scorching bare steel that burned through his uniform fabric. Mueller pressed his face against the gunner's sight, watching heat shimmer distort the landscape into shimmering waves that made distance impossible to judge. Grit worked its way into absolutely everything: the ammunition mechanisms, storage compartments, and even between his teeth. The Maybach engine behind him roared at full power, consuming fuel and producing its own furnace effect. Exhaust fumes mixed with the acrid reek of overheated oil and human sweat, creating a toxic atmosphere that seared his lungs with every agonized breath. "Gunner, traverse left 30 degrees. The commander's voice cut through the inner communication system, barely rising above the mechanical symphony of grinding gears and rattling track links. Mueller grabbed the manual turret traverse wheel, muscles straining against the resistance. In this heat, the lubricants had thinned to nothing, making every rotation feel like wrestling with a rusted mechanism that refused to cooperate. The radio crackled with fragments of German voices. Tank commanders reported problems to each other through bursts of static. The 10-watt radio struggled to maintain coherent contact beyond a few hundred meters when vehicles were moving. Mueller caught pieces of urgent conversation: engine failures, track problems, the familiar refrain about fuel shortages: always fuel. The Maybach's thirst was insatiable, consuming diesel at an alarming rate across this punishing terrain, while supply convoys faced constant harassment from British forces determined to cut off their lifeline. Through his periscope, Mueller watched their lead tanks suddenly lurch to a halt. Black smoke erupted from its engine compartment like a volcano. The crew scrambled out of the hatches, sprinting away from their disabled machine as flames started consuming the rear deck. Sand had worked its way into the engine's air filtration system again, causing a catastrophic overheat that the cooling system couldn't manage. It was the third breakdown that morning. Mueller felt dread settle into his stomach like cold lead. "Driver, halt! Radio man, try reaching battalion command," the commander's voice ordered through the intercom. Their own tank shuddered to a stop. Mueller could hear the cooling system struggling, metal expanding and contracting with sharp pinging sounds that reverberated through the hull. The driver, a young Bavarian named Schmidt, called out from his compartment below. "Sir, oil pressure is dropping fast. We need to shut down the engine before we seize the block." The radio operator frantically worked his equipment, attempting to establish contact with headquarters. Only empty static answered his desperate calls. Mueller felt sweat pooling around his boots in the lower fighting compartment. The 75mm shells, stacked around him in every available space, presented another hazard he couldn't ignore. High explosive rounds could cook off in this brutal heat, transforming their tank into a massive bomb that would incinerate them all. The armor protecting them had transformed into an oven, methodically baking the crew alive from the inside. Outside, the desert stretched infinitely in every direction. No shadows, no relief, no escape from the sun that had turned their steel fortress into a chamber of horrors. The original Panzer IV design from 1937 had never been engineered for fighting in such extreme conditions. The cooling system, perfectly adequate for European temperatures, proved hopelessly inadequate against African heat. The commander made a decision that would haunt Mueller for the remainder of his life. "We abandon the tank, take only essential equipment and water. We march back to the supply depot." The words struck like physical blows to Mueller's chest. Abandoning their Panzer IV meant accepting defeat, surrendering to the harsh reality that the machine they had trained on and trusted with their lives had finally failed them. The crew began their grim preparations for leaving. They gathered what little water remained, perhaps 2 liters shared among 5 exhausted men. Essential equipment meant ammunition, maps, and the emergency medical kit. Everything else, including personal belongings and extra clothing, would remain behind in the disabled machine. As they climbed through the hatches into the open air, the desert struck them like an open furnace door. The sun blazed with merciless fury overhead. Sand reflected such intense heat that each breath felt like swallowing fire. Mueller glanced back at their Panzer IV, its camouflage paint blistered and peeling, its tracks buried in shifting dunes. This machine that German propaganda had called invincible sat motionless and defeated, beaten not by enemy weapons but by the simple physics of metal stress and mechanical breakdown. The march across burning sand began immediately, draining their strength with every step. Within the first hour, Schmidt was stumbling badly, his face flushed with heat stroke. The radio operator carrying the portable equipment fell behind as weight and dehydration conspired to slow him down. The commander drove them forward, knowing that any stop in this furnace meant death. Mueller's thoughts drifted back to the training facility in Germany, where instructors had praised the Panzer IV's reliability and versatility. They had practiced gunnery drills and maintenance procedures religiously, but nobody had explained the human cost of operating in temperatures that shattered every design specification. No manual covered how to function when your tank becomes a slow cooker, or how to survive when mechanical failure leaves you 40 miles from friendly forces. As midday approached and the sun reached its zenith, Mueller grasped with absolute clarity why serving as a Panzer IV crewman was a death sentence. The tank designed to spearhead German victories had become their prison, and their abandonment of it might now become their execution. The desert stretched ahead, indifferent to nationality, training, or desperate survival needs. In this moment, war had reduced to its most basic truth: human endurance against an environment that showed no mercy to anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Winter transformed Mueller's world from furnace to frozen tomb. Snow crunched beneath the Panzer IV's tracks as temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees. Inside the tank, their breath crystallized into clouds that froze instantly against the steel walls, creating permanent layers of ice. Those same metal surfaces that had scalded flesh in Africa now froze skin on contact in seconds. Mueller flexed his fingers inside wool-lined gloves, struggling to maintain sensation as he adjusted the gun controls. The 75mm cannon's hydraulic traverse system had frozen solid 3 days earlier, forcing them back to manual operation. Each time Mueller cranked the traverse wheel, ice crystals broke loose with sharp cracking sounds that echoed through the compartment. The gun's recoil system, designed for moderate climates, had become sluggish and unpredictable in the extreme cold. Starting the Maybach each morning required a ritual. Schmidt, their driver, would heat engine components with a portable brazier before attempting ignition. Even then, the engine ran rough, misfiring on cylinders where fuel had partially frozen in the injection lines. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stack, a telltale beacon that Soviet forces could spot from miles away. Contact front, 800 meters. 3 T-34s advancing through the tree line. The commander's voice crackled through the intercom, distorted by the cold that affected even their electrical connections. Mueller pressed his eye against the gunner's sight. Soviet tanks emerged from the snow-laden pines, moving with impressive fluidity. Their wide tracks distributed weight effectively across the frozen ground, while the Panzer's narrower tracks punched through the snow crust, limiting mobility. The ammunition stored around Mueller presented yet another hazard. Shells exposed to -40 degrees could shatter upon firing, sending razor-sharp fragments through the fighting compartment instead of toward the target. High explosive rounds proved particularly unreliable. Fuses designed for temperate climates often failed to detonate properly in extreme cold. Armor-piercing shells performed somewhat better, though even they suffered from reduced accuracy as thermal differences affected barrel alignment. Load armor-piercing, the commander commanded. Mueller's loader, a replacement for their original crew member who had succumbed to frostbite weeks earlier, struggled with the frozen shell. Bulky winter clothing barely fit inside the cramped turret, making his movements clumsy and inefficient. The brass cartridge case stuck momentarily in the breech mechanism before finally seating properly. Ice crystals falling as the breech closed with a sharp metallic clang. The T-34 fired first. Its muzzle flash illuminated the winter landscape for an instant before the shell screamed past their turret, striking snow 20 meters behind them. Soviet gunnery had improved dramatically since the early Barbarossa days. Their crews now understood range estimation and target leading, while German tankers struggled with frozen equipment and inadequate winter preparation. Mueller squeezed the firing trigger. The gun recoiled with violent force, shattering ice formations throughout the turret. Through his sight, he watched the tracer round arc through frigid air before striking the lead T-34's sloped frontal armor. The shell deflected upward, its trajectory altered by the Soviet tank's revolutionary angled design that German engineers had once dismissed as unnecessarily complicated. The turret cranked around with a grinding, protesting sound as Mueller fought the manual mechanism, desperately trying to keep pace with targets that refused to stay still. The cold had done terrible things to the machinery. Grease had crystallized into something more like concrete, making every movement feel like wrestling with the tank itself. By the time he could adjust his aim and squeeze off another shot, the Soviet tanks had already shifted position, slipping away from his crosshairs like ghosts. The Russians had advantages Mueller couldn't overcome. Their machines moved with a freedom the Panzer couldn't match, and the snow worked entirely in their favor. More Soviet armor kept appearing from places they shouldn't have been, emerging from concealed positions that German intelligence had somehow missed entirely. This wasn't just combat anymore. It was an ambush, carefully orchestrated, and the Germans had walked straight into it. Everything about the German position screamed vulnerability. Their movements had become predictable, mechanical, and worse than that, their equipment had already started failing in this murderous cold. The Soviets had figured out how to use the weather as a weapon. They kept their crews in heated shelters until the moment they were needed, rotating machines in and out of cover to maintain fighting strength. The Germans, meanwhile, endured exposure that seemed designed to strip the life from them. Through chattering teeth, the radio operator delivered news that made everyone's blood run colder than the winter around them. "Sir, battalion reports the fuel convoy was hit by partisans. No resupply possible for at least 48 hours. The diesel had begun to thicken at the bottom of the tank, turning into a waxy sludge that threatened to stop them cold. Keeping the engine running prevented it from solidifying completely, but every second the motor turned over, ate through their remaining fuel at a terrifying rate. Stay moving and exhaust your supplies, or stop and freeze in place. There was no good answer, only different ways to lose." A second T-34 swung around their flank, using its superior agility to position itself where the Panzer's limited turret traverse couldn't follow fast enough. Mueller watched helplessly as the Soviet gunner found the perfect angle, setting up a shot that would end everything. The frontal armor, 70 millimeters of steel that should have meant something, offered almost no protection against a gun pointed at their SID. The T-34's main gun, a 76.2 millimeter piece, could punch through their side armor from over 1,000 meters out. The shell came without warning, without mercy. When it hit, the impact sent a shower of razor-edge steel fragments screaming through the fighting compartment. The metal ricochet bounced off the opposite wall and detonated near the ammunition storage with a secondary blast that turned the turret into a butcher shop. Shrapnel tore through Mueller's left shoulder, and he felt the shock before the pain, felt warm blood immediately freezing against his torn uniform. The loader crumpled without a sound, his chest opened by jagged metal that painted the turret walls with a crimson ice that would never fully come clean. From the driver's compartment, Schmitz's panicked voice cut through the chaos. "Engine hit, oil pressure is 0, we're losing everything." The Maybach engine coughed twice and died, leaving them immobilized in a zone designed for killing. Emergency lights flickered to life, powered by batteries that might last 30 minutes in this cold before their chemical reaction slowed to nothing. Bauer made a decision that meant survival or death. Everyone out, get the wounded, grab what matters. But evacuating a disabled tank in Russian winter meant walking into something far worse than any desert had ever been. The cold would kill them inside hours if Soviet guns didn't do it first. Mueller understood, as he prepared to abandon his frozen metal tomb, that all the engineering excellence in the world meant nothing when the environment itself became the enemy. German machinery had been built for European warfare, not for conditions that turned oil into concrete and made steel brittle enough to shatter. July 1943 brought a different kind of hell. The summer heat baked the Russian steppe around Kursk, and Mueller found himself assigned to a new panzer crew, despite shoulders still aching from shrapnel wounds earned in that winter nightmare. Experienced gunners had become precious, and the Wehrmacht needed every qualified man for Operation Citadel, the massive offensive meant to restore German momentum. Mueller could see the problems from where he sat in the gunner's position, could read the desperation between the lines of operational orders. His new commander, Oberfeldwebel Wagner, was a veteran of the France campaign who still believed in German engineering superiority. Wagner hadn't yet learned what Mueller knew in his bones, that the Panzer IV's limitations were becoming fatal. The T-34 had evolved throughout the war, growing thicker armor and more devastating guns, while the Panzer IV remained essentially unchanged from its 1937 design. The gap between the machines had widened into a chasm. The pre-dawn darkness on July 5th concealed thousands of German tanks moving into assault positions. Mueller's Panzer formed part of 2nd Panzer Army's spearhead, tasked with breaking through defensive lines that intelligence claimed were lightly defended. Through his periscope, he caught silhouettes of Tiger tanks and Ferdinand destroyers, machines representing Germany's technological response to Soviet improvements. But for every advanced vehicle, a dozen Panzer IVs bore the weight of the assault. Wagner's voice crackled through the intercom as artillery began its work. "Gunner, load high explosive. We move in 30 seconds. Mueller's loader, a teenager named Klein, with barely 4 weeks of training, fumbled with the 75mm shell. The boy's hands shook from some combination of fear and adrenaline that Mueller couldn't quite separate. Training had been compressed from 16 weeks to 4 as manpower reserves dwindled, producing crews who knew theory but had never fought. The tank lurched forward as their driver engaged the transmission, rolling across the steppe toward Soviet positions as part of a steel wave. Mueller scanned for targets through his sight, watching the growing dawn light reveal what lay ahead. The manual traverse remained sluggish despite recent maintenance. Parts had become scarce, and workshops were salvaging components from damaged tanks, piecing together machines from mismatched replacements. Throughout the tank, critical systems bore the marks of hasty manufacturing and inferior materials. Soviet artillery opened up as the German assault force closed to 2,000 meters. Mueller watched earth fountains erupt around advancing tanks, some shells finding their marks with devastating precision. A Panzer to their left vanished in an orange fireball, the ammunition storage igniting, secondary explosions ripping the turret clean off the hull and hurling it spinning through the air. The crew never had a chance. Wagner spotted movement through his cupola. Anti-tank guns, 11 o'clock, 600 meters. Traverse left, engage. Mueller cranked the manual mechanism, feeling the familiar resistance of worn gears and insufficient lubrication. The hydraulic system had failed during their approach march, another casualty of parts shortages and improvised repairs. By the time his gun barrel aligned, the Soviet anti-tank crew had already fired. Their 45mm shell struck the frontal armor with a sharp crack that resonated through the fighting compartment. The Panzer's 50mm protection held against the relatively light gun, but metal splinters ricocheted inside the hull. Klein cried out as fragments peppered his legs, bright blood spattering across the ammunition racks. He kept loading shells despite his wounds, driven by equal measures of training and terror. Mueller's return shot pulverized the Soviet position, but 3 more anti-tank weapons opened fire from concealed locations. German intelligence had severely underestimated the density and sophistication of Soviet defenses. Hidden T-34s emerged from camouflaged positions, machines equipped with improved 76mm guns, capable of penetrating Panzer armor from over 1,000 meters away. German advantages in optics and crew training were evaporating as Soviet gunners accumulated combat experience. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as more Soviet armor appeared on the flanks. The T-34s used their superior mobility and sloped armor to engage from positions of advantage while remaining difficult targets themselves. Mueller watched his shots deflect off enemy armor that presented optimal ricochet angles, while return fire found vulnerable points in the Panzer IV with increasing precision. That 45-degree sloped armor, effectively doubling protection, represented a design principle German engineers had dismissed as unnecessarily complicated. Wagner's voice became increasingly desperate as options disappeared. Driver, reverse. We need cover behind that ridge. Their retreat route was blocked by disabled German armor, casualties of a defensive system far more sophisticated than pre-battle intelligence had suggested. Soviet forces had learned to create killing zones where damaged vehicles became obstacles for surviving tanks, channeling German movement into predetermined fire zones. A T-34 swung around their position, its wide tracks distributing ground pressure perfectly for rapid movement across soft terrain. Mueller attempted to traverse his gun toward the threat, but the manual system couldn't match the speed of enemy maneuver. The Soviet tank commander fired at nearly point-blank range, the muzzle flash visible through Mueller's periscope an instant before impact. The penetrating shot struck just forward of the turret ring, fragments screaming through the fighting compartment. Klein's torso was shredded by jagged metal, while Wagner slumped over his commander's controls, unconscious or worse. Mueller felt warm wetness on his face, blood from wounds he couldn't yet assess through the shock. The loader's position held only torn fabric and spreading crimson stains that would never wash away. Their driver reported through the intercom system that somehow still functioned despite the devastation. "Sir, engine compartment is on fire, fuel lines are ruptured." Orange flames licked at the rear of the tank as diesel ignited, threatening to reach the main fuel tank and trigger an explosion that would vaporize everything inside the hull. The automatic fire suppression system was dead, another victim of parts shortages and inadequate maintenance. Mueller dragged Wagner's unconscious form toward the commander's hatch as smoke filled the fighting compartment. His commander's weight reminded him of all the crews he'd lost to equipment failures, environmental extremes, and tactical situations where German doctrine proved inadequate. The Panzer IV, that had once represented technological superiority, had become a death trap for undertrained crews operating machines that enemy weapons could penetrate with ease. As he struggled to evacuate his burning tank, Mueller understood that Operation Citadel would fail not from Soviet numerical advantage, but because the fundamental assumptions of German armored warfare no longer matched reality. Mechanical reliability meant nothing when enemy guns could tear through your armor, and crew training advantages had evaporated as replacement personnel arrived with barely sufficient preparation for modern combat. By June 1944, the Norman bocage trapped Mueller's Panzer in a maze of narrow lanes bounded by ancient earthen banks crowned with thick vegetation. Each field boundary became a natural anti-tank barrier, channeling German armor into killing zones where Allied forces waited with superior weapons and coordinated tactics. Mueller peered through his gun sight at the impenetrable green walls that had transformed the French countryside into a fortress designed specifically to destroy tanks. His latest crew consisted entirely of replacements rushed from training depots. The commander, young Lieutenant Richter, was 19 years old and had never seen combat before D-Day. Their driver Hoffmann had completed his abbreviated training just 2 weeks earlier, while the loader possessed even less experience. These boys represented the Wehrmacht's future, undertrained, under-equipped, and facing enemies who had perfected the art of killing German armor. The Panzer itself showed cumulative damage from material shortages and manufacturing compromises. Steel plates were thinner and more brittle than pre-war standards, welded with inferior materials that created weak points throughout the hull. The armor that had once meant protection now featured gaps and inconsistencies that experienced Allied gunners exploited without mercy. The road wheels had been cast from salvaged metal that wore away with alarming speed, while rubber seals had given way to synthetic substitutes that crumbled when exposed to the rigors of combat. Through the intercom, Richter's voice trembled with barely controlled anxiety as he worked to assess their predicament. "Gunner, can you make out anything through that opening in the hedge?" Reports indicated American Sherman tanks pushing forward along a parallel route. Mueller swept his gun sight across the dense vegetation, searching for targets, but the overgrown hedgerows limited visibility to barely 50 meters in any direction. The confining landscape negated everything their Panzer should have offered: the long-range firepower they'd trained with, the precision gunnery at distance. Here, survival came down to crew experience and reflexes, not the specifications printed in manuals. The first warning came suddenly. Artillery shells began landing with terrifying precision, bracketing their position from multiple angles. American forward observers with superior radio networks were directing this barrage, transforming ordinary hedgerows into death traps. Each explosion sent the Panzer shuddering violently, fragments singing against the armor plates. Mueller gripped his controls, wondering if the next direct hit would punch through. Then he spotted it. Through a gap in the hedgeline, the unmistakable profile of a Sherman Firefly, the British variant mounting a 17-pounder that could tear through their armor at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. The Allied tank moved with practiced ease through terrain its crews had trained specifically for, while German doctrine still emphasized mobile warfare in open country, tactics useless in these suffocating spaces. Richter's composure finally cracked as more armor appeared along the approach routes. "Driver, reverse. Find us better ground." Hoffmann's hands fumbled at the transmission controls. Grinding gears, jerky movements, every motion broadcasting their position to enemy observers for kilometers. The boy had never operated 30 tons of fighting steel under fire, and his panic was costing them. The tactical radio crackled constantly, fragmentary reports from other German units painting desperate pictures. Individual tanks facing coordinated Allied assaults. American forces had learned to weave armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft into unified formations that overwhelmed through superior coordination rather than equipment alone. German command structure, designed for rapid offensives, crumbled when forced into defense against enemies controlling the pace of battle. A Sherman materialized from concealment barely 200 meters distant, its gun traversing toward them with hydraulic smoothness that contrasted grotesquely with their manual mechanisms. Mueller attempted to fire first, but his traverse system jammed halfway through rotation, leaving his gun pointed uselessly into empty field. The loader wrestled with ammunition manufactured under wartime shortcuts. The brass cartridge case stuck fast in the breech at the critical moment. The American gunner fired first. The 75mm shell cracked through their side armor, sending a cascade of fragments through the fighting compartment. Hoffmann screamed as jagged metal tore into his back, severing his spine, leaving him paralyzed and helpless in the driver's seat. Blood pooled on the floor plates, mixing with hydraulic fluid leaking from ruptured systems. Richter attempted to coordinate through the radio, but electrical failure was consuming the tank's systems. The already inadequate German radio couldn't penetrate the electromagnetic interference from Allied jamming equipment. Their crew fought alone, while enemies maintained constant contact with supporting forces capable of arrival within minutes. A second Sherman positioned itself along their left flank, taking advantage of their limited traverse arc. Mueller fought with the jammed gun mechanism, knowing mechanical failure, not enemy skill, would decide their fate. Wartime metallurgy had degraded components that failed under routine stress, turning standard maintenance into survival issues when time for repairs didn't exist. The flanking Sherman fired at point-blank range. Its armor-piercing round punched through the turret armor effortlessly, ricocheting inside the compartment in a shower of steel fragments. Mueller felt something tear through his right leg, the impact spinning him away from the gunner's controls as blood soaked through his uniform. Richter's voice had become a wet whisper. Lung damage from spall fragments made each breath a struggle. The 19-year-old officer who dreamed of military glory was dying in a machine representing Germany's technological collapse, blood-flecked foam bubbling from his damaged lung. The loader had already fled through his hatch, abandoning his wounded comrades for survival. Mueller couldn't blame him. Crew cohesion required training and emotional bonds that Germany could no longer provide. Replacements arrived at the front with theoretical knowledge, but no connection to their units, dissolving under pressure rather than enduring. As Mueller dragged himself toward the commander's hatch, stepping over Hoffmann's motionless body and leaving Richter to die, he understood the truth. The Panzer hadn't become obsolete through enemy innovation, but through German industrial collapse. Substandard materials, inexperienced workers, undertrained crews committed to situations where design limitations proved fatal. The Normandy hedgerows had become a graveyard for German armored doctrine, where tank battles hinged on crew training and equipment reliability rather than tactical brilliance. By April 1945, Hans Mueller's Panzer IV sat behind rubble in Berlin's destroyed streets, transformed from mobile weapon into a static fortress. Concrete barriers and twisted girders funneled Soviet armor into narrow corridors where German defenders waited with whatever remained functional. The gun barrel protruded through a carefully constructed opening, providing limited fields of fire down a ravaged street. His crew consisted of Weber, a 15-year-old Hitler Youth member serving as loader Steinberg, a 53-year-old Volkssturm conscript thrust into command despite possessing no tank experience, and a wounded Luftwaffe pilot whose burned hands barely managed the controls. These were not tank crews in any professional sense. They were desperate men assembled by administrative necessity rather than tactical planning. The Panzer itself embodied Germany's final industrial degradation. Armor plating welded from salvaged steel scavenged from destroyed vehicles created an irregular patchwork, providing uneven protection. The main guns rifling, worn smooth from repeated firing without replacement barrels, couldn't group shots accurately beyond 300 meters. Ammunition consisted of mismatched shells scavenged from depot ruins with varying ballistic properties making precise fire impossible. Weber's hands shook as he loaded another mismatched round. His Hitler Youth training had prepared him for parades, not this visceral reality. He'd never seen a corpse before joining Mueller's crew 3 days ago, and now he stepped over bodies with mechanical indifference. His emotional capacity overwhelmed. His uniform hung loose, borrowed from a dead soldier stripped of usable equipment. Steinberg peered through his commander's periscope with concentrated intensity, a former postal clerk learning tank operations through combat, having volunteered expecting rear area assignment. German defensive lines had collapsed, eliminating any distinction between front and rear. Every capable man faced direct combat. Soviet tracked vehicles echoed through urban canyons as armor approached. T-34s moved carefully through debris, their commanders aware that disabled German tanks posed hidden threats. Soviet infantry followed, using rubble piles for cover. Mueller adjusted his gun sight as the first T-34 appeared 400 meters away, turret traversing slowly. The Soviet tank bore battle scars, missing vision blocks, scarred armor, marks of veteran crews who'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin through 3 years of increasingly bitter warfare. These weren't desperate conscripts, but hardened soldiers. The tactical situation offered no favorable options. Soviet forces controlled approaches, while German ammunition supplies were insufficient for sustained combat. Retreat meant execution by SS units. Surrender meant probable death. Soviet forces showed little interest in taking prisoners from Hitler Youth and Volkssturm irregulars. Steinberg's stressed voice coordinated their defense. Gunner, target the lead tank, load armor-piercing. Weber fumbled with a shell marked from 1941 when German industry still maintained standards. Probably more reliable than their degraded gun barrel. The T-34 fired first, its 85mm shell striking the rubble, protecting their hull. Concrete fragments showered the Panzer as the position was marked for destruction. Soviet gunnery had evolved to deliberate, accurate fire, methodically eliminating defensive positions. Mueller returned fire, his shot striking the Soviet tank's sloped frontal armor and deflecting skyward. The worn barrel lacked sufficient velocity for penetration. The T-34's revolutionary armor design, once dismissed by German engineers as unnecessarily complex, had proven superior through thousands of battlefield encounters. 120mm of effective thickness made frontal penetration impossible for their degraded armament. A second Soviet tank flanked their position, using building ruins as concealment. Urban terrain provided multiple approach routes, negating prepared defensive advantages. German doctrine developed for open terrain proved inadequate for close-quarters city fighting. Weber began crying as he loaded another shell, tears streaming down his face as reality overwhelmed his adolescent capacity. 3 days of combat had shattered his propaganda-fed beliefs about German superiority and inevitable victory. His sobs echoed through the compartment as childhood assumptions about justice crashed against adult horrors. The flanking T-34 fired at point-blank range. Its shell penetrated side armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. Weber disappeared in a cloud of red mist, his 15-year-old body vaporized by forces turning steel and human tissue into vapor. Steinberg's scream ended abruptly as Spall knocked him unconscious. The pilot called from the driver's position that engine damage had immobilized their tank permanently. Hydraulic fluid mixed with blood on the compartment floor as systems failed throughout the vehicle. The Panzer IV that had once represented German technological superiority was dying in the city where it had been designed, its destruction symbolic of industrial collapse, making this outcome inevitable. As Soviet infantry surrounded their disabled tank, Mueller understood survival depended entirely on enemy mercy. The Panzer IV's evolution from breakthrough weapon to desperate last stand mirrored Nazi Germany's own trajectory. Initial success followed by gradual degradation and final collapse when foundational assumptions proved inadequate against adaptive opponents who learned from every defeat.